So, Jim, is buy-to-let investment ethical?
Well, that's the $64 million question, isn't it?
Yes,
It's like a lot of people. I tell you what, there'll be people out there immediately saying to themselves, "No, buy-to-let's no ethical at all." But once we finish with this, I think you'll see this in a completely different light. Because I was gobsmacked at the amount of investment that goes in from the private sector. And let's just call it the private sector, because let's be honest, if you say private landlords, everybody goes, they're all up in arms. But if you say the private sector, like they do with schools, with everything else that comes from the private sector when they invest in it, everybody goes, oh, that's all right then. But as soon as you say private landlord, it's like whoosh, everybody's up in their arms.
So
like, oh, let's get them, get pitchforks and torches out. Let's get them. those nasty private landlords. It's like that's how people look at it, isn't it?
It is. It definitely is, and there's a lot of controversy around it. And there's a lot of, I mean, landlords. And as soon as you say a landlord or investor, it's like there's a lot of negative feedback, and people do vilify them. And I mean, even the Scottish government, recent changes and things have just totally made it so difficult, and ultimately vilifying landlords making it so difficult.
If any other group of people, because remember, this is about 250,000 people in Scotland. Yeah. If I told you 250,000 people were being picked on and actually continually bullied on social media and continually name called and vilified and demonized on social media, you'd be going like, wait a minute, that's a bit of discrimination, isn't it, against a minority group? It's like, but as soon as I say it's private landlords, everybody goes, yeah, that's okay, that's fine then.
It is, yeah.
And that, almost that's what it is. I heard the other day, it was in the media, that some private landlords are no wanting to be called private landlords anymore. And I'm like, I'll tell you what, I'm very proud to be a private landlord, and I have been for over 30 years. And I've done something that no one else is prepared to do for people, for the most vulnerable people in our society. And that's what we should be proud of as private landlords, because once you're finished with this, you'll know straight away that I'll say it where the blame lies, right smack bang with the Scottish government for their failure to make sure there's adequate housing for everybody and to accommodate the most vulnerable people in our system. And the legislation, don't count on that either. Everybody's up in arms, even the chief executives of local authorities, the housing officers of local authorities, and all the heads of housing the local authorities in Scotland saying you need to repeal this legislation. It is killing. It is increasing homelessness as we go. We're at a homelessness rate which is actually extremely high now. I saw the press release the other day, and it's like, wow. It's like presiding over their watch. Homelessness is at an all-time record again when the figures are out, and it's gone even higher than it was last year. And it's not because of private landlords. It's because Paul McLennan, the housing minister, has admitted it. The 110,000 houses they had committed to build over the next 11 years are not going to appear.
No.
It was a vote catcher, a vote winner. There's no 110,000 houses. It's never going to happen. The SNP has let down the Scottish people again.
Yeah,
I hate to get political about it, but you can't. You can only lay it where it's. You can only lay the blame where it lies. It's like you have to call them out on it, and I hate saying it about the SNP because they've done some really good things, but the very fact is they've done some horrendous things and they just don't get it right. I do think it's a lot of people are not educated commercially. In other words, they don't understand the commercial implications of what they're doing. They actually just think on a more an educational level. You know, like for example, in a hyperbolic chamber where there's nothing else that could happen in the world, and it's like, what if we did this? And it's like, and thinking nothing else will happen because they did that, and that'll solve all our problems. No, you just create a problem elsewhere, and that fact, you actually create a lot of problems elsewhere, which really make it worse for people overall and the most vulnerable in society. But let's talk about this, Richard. You've got something to say about this.
I was just going to say, I mean, you're totally right, Jim, and that is what it's all about. And the implications of what the changes that I've made, I mean, it's the vulnerable people at the bottom that really feel it. And that's what they've not thought ahead and really taken on board. And ultimately, that's who suffers for it. But today, we're going to talk about the changing landscape of the Fife housing market and really explore the ethical dimensions of buy-to-let investment, really, and break it down.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
There is a lot of interesting stats and things in here that will surprise a lot of people. And I think, firstly, we need to obviously address that we've all witnessed a profound transformation in the housing landscape over the last few years, with everything, the pandemic and changes in legislation and everything. And the surge in private renting has led to a significant amount of debates about the morality of buy-to-let and the buy-to-let market. So I think we're going to break down stats today and compare like from now and 40 years ago, and show the seismic shift and looking at local authorities and obviously the private sector as well.
Particularly in Fife Council. I mean, it's Fife we're obviously dealing with, but this more or less applies to, I could take every single local authority in the whole of Scotland and the whole of Britain as well, and probably come up with the same statistics. Same statistics, almost overall, like for like. But it paints the same picture overall, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the statistics then? You know, how many Fife households are actually in the private renting sector?
So currently, as we are in 2023, there's 21,633 households that are in the private rented sector now, which represents 12.7% of all homes in the local authority area. And this is Fife we're talking about.
And that goes exactly against any rhetoric about people saying there's about 18 to 20% of houses in the private sector. So actually in Fife, we've got a lot less properties in the private rented sector than the UK average.
Yeah, and I think
So how does that compare then to, let's look back the 40 years as you said, how does that then compare to like 1981 numbers then?
Well, interestingly, when we compare it to 1981, which is around about 40 years ago, there was 7,020 Fife households which were in the private rented sector, and that only represents 6% of all the houses in the local authority. So, I mean, people might feel it's almost doubled, or it's just over doubled, but it's still a low figure.
That's effectively a third, Richard. That's actually tripled. So it's tripled. I mean, percentage-wise, it's doubled. Now, you see that where you see percentage-wise it doubles, right? It's because the number of households in Fife in 1981 were significantly less than what they are now. You know, there was probably about, I think, around about 116, 117,000. So the 7,000 represented 6% of that, whereas the 21,000 represented just over 13% of about 170,000 households in Fife. So since in the 40 years, there's been a significant amount of households built in Fife, increasing from about 120 to 170,000, about 50,000 more. So there's a lot of houses being built. So how on earth is that, you know, is that possible that we're still in a housing crisis and people still don't have houses? That's mental.
Yeah, this is when people start to then question and start having discussions about maybe like the role of like baby boomers and things, the baby boomer generation. Like, are they exacerbating the housing crisis? And then that's when we get into the ethical implications of the buy-to-let phenomenon. And is that, do you know what I mean? And that's when this is when all the controversy starts.
I could just imagine a younger person castigating the baby boomer generation. How dare you be born? It's like, wait a minute, if I wasn't born, you wouldn't be here.
But that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to delve into obviously the different factors contributing into the Fife housing challenges and examine like generational and economic imbalances, and we'll look at the history of obviously the housing policies, and dissect the impact of financial deregulation and evaluate the moral questions surrounding the buy-to-let market.
Okay, so let's deal with the generational impact of economic disparities, right? Let me just lead on this.
Okay.
The housing crisis in Fife has ignited a debate over whether the baby boom generation, that's the age between 59 and 76, bears responsibility for the present situation. So that born after the World War II, that is, this generation experienced unparalleled economic growth. and prosperity during the 1970s and 1980s, benefiting from improved education, government subsidies, and rising property prices overall, including actually technological advancements. However, critics argue that the success of the baby boomers has contributed to the generational economic imbalance, leaving their children actually struggling with soaring rents and burdensome mortgages. So let's take a glimpse into the past of the Fife property market then, Richard. What could we talk about that then?
Yeah, I mean, to comprehend Fife's current housing challenges, one really must trace the key events that shaped its housing market. And that is the mass contribution of council housing during the 1950s and the 60s. Obviously, there was lots of council housing built, but then followed by the sell-off of many council houses in the 1980s, which was under Thatcher's government. And it's blamed, and many blame that for the role in altering the market dynamics.
This is quite an interesting one because this comes up every single time, doesn't it? It's all Margaret Thatcher's fault. It's all the Conservative Party's fault. It's like, get over it. It was 40 years ago. What have you done in the last 40 years to reverse that?
Yeah.
Diddly squat, in my opinion. But we'll go through these statistics and see exactly what they've done. You know, because you can't. I mean, how long are they going to trade on this? About every single time saying it's all the Conservative Party's fault, it's all Margaret Thatcher's fault, it's her government sold off all these houses. It's like, well, what did you do to replace them in the 40 years? This is what I want to talk about. So I'll give you an idea about the number involved. Okay, so 36,957 Fife households are now in the social housing sector. That's council houses and housing associations combined. That represents round about 22% of our homes in our local authority area. But interestingly, we compare it with 1981 figures for Fife. 69,000 Fife households were in the social housing rented sector, representing 59% of all homes in our local authority area. So as you can see, the numbers are seismically different. So what other issues have been causing this? Well, the early 1990s witnessed skyrocketing interest rates. I mean, I'll remember that. They were 15% at one point, leading to a widespread repossessions in Fife and the UK as a whole. This was one of the catalysts that contributed to the underlying housing crisis of today. The other one you've got to think about, Richard, and you're going to talk about this just now, is give me a flavour of what financial deregulation and buy-to-let investments did.
Yeah, well, another catalyst was risky lending practices, and that was not just in the UK, it was in the USA in the early 2000s. And UK banks started introducing 100% mortgages and even riskier lending practices with Northern Rock lending 125% mortgages. And well, we all know what happened to Northern Rock.
I saw this writing on the wall. I remember actually my predecessor for Fife Properties, Andrew Trail, sitting in front of me when I was saying I'm looking for a new mortgage and proposing to me that I actually take this 125% mortgage from Northern Rock. And I'm like, okay, so you're going to give me 125% of the value of my house, but 25% of that doesn't exist just now. So how could that be the case? And his response to that at the time was, this is how everybody's response was. I suppose this was what the Northern Rock's rhetoric was. Oh, well, over a period of time, you'll stay in your property and it'll appreciate in value. Therefore, you know, we'll be able to absorb that over the period of time. But what they didn't realise and what they failed to realise is the liquidity was extremely at risk. Because basically what they've done is they were just saying, actually, we've lent more money than we actually have. And we have now got more borrowings than we have assets. So therefore, if it came to a standing start and we had to pay off our debts, we couldn't. Because all our money's been given away to someone else. And for me personally, I never went for that 125% mortgage. And the reason for that was because I just couldn't get my head around the fact that you're going to get me into further debt with money I don't actually have and assets I don't have. And at that time, remember, I can't remember, I was training to be an accountant. And I just thought, that means I'll be in a negative balance sheet.
Yeah.
Because you've given me more money than I can actually have assets. So my balance sheet will be sitting negative. So my net worth will be negative. And I said, so what should I spend this 25% on then? And he went, "Oh, just go and buy a car or something." It's like,
No,
honestly.
really?
So he said, just go, yeah, you can go buy a car, you can go on a wonderful holiday. And I'm like, wait a minute,
That's crazy.
these aren't assets either. Now, this is me. Remember, I hadn't been involved in buy to let at that time when I was doing this. So I wasn't as savvy because this was on my own personal house at that time. I think we were in Taylor Street at that time. And we hadn't got to the point of renting yet. So we hadn't gotten point to the buy to let yet, the buy to let market. So that's when I thought to myself, this doesn't sound right at all. And even though everybody was doing it, I just thought, nah, it's something I'm not going to do. And history proved me right. You know, the very fact was, I said, this isn't it. Something's going to go wrong here.
So
There's
not going
just
to go with
something
the
not right
wall.
about this. You don't give away 125% the value of an asset, and you've really not got any security on 25% of that. If not, you've probably not got any security on 45% of that, because if you have to repossess it and sell off, you probably only get 87% of the value. That's how repossessions work, even though they're perfectly all okay. That's how the market happens. That's why it's good to buy. Sometimes it's good to jump in and buy repossessions, because repossessions are just changing. You know, you put the water back on, you put the electric back on, and you put the heating back on and fill it up and test it again, and usually everything's fine. But they can't give any warranties for the repossessions, therefore they have to downgrade the value in comparison to the market value itself. So often that's why it's a good market to be in. Now, luckily, I was in that market in the very beginning, and I was able to pick up a lot of them like that and actually make good capital gains out of it as well. But
I mean,
it supported the housing market at the time. It allowed people to upgrade. It allowed people to find new houses. And I think as an investor, that's always welcome to have investment in a market which is actually declining.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, this was, I mean, the early noughties before I was in the industry, but I remember 2008, 2009 when Northern Rock and it all kind of went to the wall. But even when I come in to start working in property, I was still dealing with a lot of repossessions and things, and that was still on the back of that as well.
Yeah.
Because I mean,
Well, this is all
100%
about
lenders.
Yeah, the lending was all built on the back of derivative swaps. Now, if
Yeah,
anybody doesn't know what derivative swaps means, this is between banks, the world banks. They would sell their debts or their mortgages between each other to make money. Now, I knew that was happening because I was in GMAC in the beginning, which was General Motors finance
yeah,
arm. Now, everybody's like, hey, what's General Motors doing having a finance arm? But they did, because they saw money in it and they started to get involved in mortgages as well. And what they did was the GMAC was actually buying prepackaged mortgages, you know, with the toxic debt included in it. So they were getting good mortgages and they were getting bad mortgages, but they were just buying them over. So they were into the mortgage market, and I was getting great deals with them. I was getting trackers, lifetime trackers at base plus 0.99. I've still got quite a few of them today. And that was in the early 2000s. So you're getting lifetime trackers at base 0.99. I'm like, you can't make any margin on that. That's absolutely crazy. There's no money to be made out of that at all by the time you work out the admin involved. So it was obvious to me at the time that there was going to be a problem with this. But the banks just kept doing it because the deregulation, as you'd said, allowed it to happen. The financial deregulation actually allowed all that to happen. The problem was with many of these derivatives contains a lot of safe, as I'd said, and low risk profit mortgages and some high risk profitable subprime USA mortgages caused by the change in the law in the US in the mid 90s and the easing of lending rules in the US through the Community Reinvestment Fund in 1995, which allowed subprime lending. They were lending at the time to people on benefits. It's like, how could you give a mortgage to somebody that's actually on benefit, but you're getting a guaranteed income? So they're just saying, because you're getting a guaranteed income and that's the amount of income, we can lend on that because the financial deregulation allows us to lend on that. Therefore, we're just going to lend to you. So loads and loads of people bought their houses and they were actually on the social welfare. That's nuts, isn't it?
Doesn't make sense.
So when the money market started getting cold feet in 2007 because the banks didn't know if their derivatives had a small or large number of high-risk subprime mortgages, the banks stopped lending to each other. Here's the key here. The banks stopped lending to each other because they were worried that it wouldn't be paid back, as many of these subprime mortgages were defaulting in 2006 and 2007 and being repossessed. This was because of the people that actually lent the money to, as I said, people on benefits who can't, well, they're there for a reason, possibly because they can't handle their money that well. So what is the likelihood of them being able to pay their mortgage of what's the likelihood of having any attempt to pay the mortgage. That's what you've got to think about. So the banks are a huge knock-on effect because the deregulation and allowed mortgage brokers to run out in there and sell all these products. Now, the people in charge weren't bothered because they were making huge bonuses because of that, because they were getting huge amount of mortgages sold.
But the numbers,
big deals. And it was giving them millions upon millions and millions of pounds of bonuses for more or less fictitious mortgages that were never ever going to get paid back. But they weren't bothered because it was going to their goals and their numbers. And yeah, well, just get another job. Why would I bother that? So this had the ripple effect as well, because to the UK's housing market, and the UK's bank had smaller funds to lend out because they could borrow more money from the money markets for the reason. So they were all intertwined. That's the problem here. They stopped lending to the high risk UK borrowers as well. And that's 95% first time buyers. Whilst at the same time, they increased their lending to lower risk landlords with buy-to-let mortgages with a 25% deposit and a stable income. So this is one of the major factors that affected that market at the time, which affected the housing market in the UK overall, which had this knock-on effect. So what about millennials and the buy-to-let controversy then? What could we say about that, Richard?
Well, the millennial generation, which was born between 1980 and the late 1990s, which is myself, I fall into that category, had been particularly affected by the surge of buy-to-let investments. So these young adults and things, shaped by the digital revolution, and they needed help entering the property market due to the competition with buy-to-let landlords. And critics often portray landlords, and Fife landlords were included in that, as greedy individuals and capitalising on the housing crisis and exacerbating a sense of social despair among millennials. However, as we wrote in the Fife Property blog a few weeks ago, the majority of Fife landlords are not increasing their rents, and we know that all too well, and never done for a long time. And if you want to read that message, drop me a
message, and you can pass it on. This was actually quite an interesting one as well, because when I go back to the very beginning, I remember in one street, for example, there was about 25 houses up for sale, which is almost 10-15% of the street. Now, I bought the majority of them and actually renovated the whole lot because they were just running to the ground. The gardens were overgrown, everything was falling apart, the properties were falling into disrepair. And I actually went in and bought a significant amount of them, which actually rejuvenated the street and got it back on track, and therefore managed to sustain that area as an economically viable and investable in property prices. Hence the reason why it started to shoot up when it came to 2006, 2007, as people saw it, it looks quite a good area. It seems to be all looked after. And that was only the reason, because I had bought a significant amount of them and actually regenerated it. So for someone to turn around and say, well, you obviously took advantage of that. Okay, if I hadn't done it, where would it have been? All these properties would probably have been sitting in disrepair and might have been picked up at some point in time. But you've seen some of these areas in Newcastle and other areas where they've knocked down whole streets, because eventually nobody wanted to go near them, because it's the pariah thing. It's the fact that if they see one trend happening about nobody buying them, everybody thinks there must be something wrong with everything. And then the next thing, everybody starts, the property prices start dropping in price. Therefore, what happened as well at that time, because no one was propping that up, that people who were trying to move out of that street and upgrade because of their circumstances weren't able to, because they were in negative equity now because they had bought at a much higher price. So by me buying, I actually sustained that market and actually pushed the prices up as a natural result, therefore allowing them to sell and actually move on to their next property. But of course, nobody acknowledges that about what private landlords did they? Nobody says that. Nobody talks about the investment, the huge amount of investment, the huge amount of risk they've put in as well. Because that capital could have gone, it could have all gone wrong. I could have been in the bank for hundreds of thousands. But I was willing to take the risk, and it was a risk at that time. It was a very high risk strategy, but it paid off. And if it hadn't paid off, would anybody else foot the bill with me? Absolutely not. It would never have happened. So you're absolutely right.
No, on you go, sorry.
So the role of property developers in the housing shortage, in response to the growing housing demand, property investors have stepped up, acquiring all these dilapidated properties, as I said, and repurposing them into habitable homes. It was not just me, it was other ones as well. So this has provided a partial solution to the shortage available for housing, and partially, particularly for those who rely on rental properties provided by landlords and property developers. So, again, there was a shortage of rental properties, and because I was regenerating them, and other landlords around the country were regenerating these properties and actually bringing them back into use, because remember, they're not in use. It took 2 years to repossess these properties at the time. The repossession laws were slow and cumbersome. Therefore, there was 2 years all these properties were sitting empty, doing absolutely nothing. And if they had been turned around quick enough, people would have had adequate housing straight away. But because of that, and because of the banks wouldn't put any more money into them because they actually ran down, it was really causing a problem in particular areas. So again, because of us stepping in and the landlord stepping in, that actually saved the day for quite a lot of properties and quite a lot of areas as a result, and allowed a lot of people to move on to the next property in their journey. And I'm talking about buyers, because remember, the buyers were actually selling. I remember one person actually came to me and said, look, I've been told by my estate agent that the housing market's going to crash. I just want to sell. Could you give me an easy exit? And I went, what are you looking for? And he said, I'm wanting this amount of money. And I went, yeah, my numbers work. I'm happy with that. I'm okay with that. So I just agreed what he wanted. I never wanted to haggle with him. It was the right amount of money at the time, and the numbers made sense for me. So I was never about pushing people down if that was the case. And I allowed them to move on. So they rented it for a period of time off me once I'd bought it. And I allowed them to then find their exact home they want to go to next. And then they found that and they moved on, and that was it.
Yeah.
So it was a risk that I was willing to take. It was things that most landlords were willing to take, and I don't think anybody else was going to take that. But just because we made money out of that, then we got castigated.
Yeah.
If we hadn't made any money, Richard, would we have got castigated?
And no. That's the main thing.
Would anybody else have picked up the bill? No.
And that's the main thing that people instantly go and start castigating landlords is, oh, you're making loads of money, and that's not the case. I mean, there's obviously
go and tell that to Jeff Bezos. Go and tell that to Jeff Bezos. Go and tell that to some of the companies that use offshore companies to avoid tax. I've never paid a bit of tax in my life. Go and tell that to the British film industry. Do not famously pay tax, and we actually have to subsidise. But we don't subsidise private landlords, and yet we castigate them left, right, and centre. But we subsidise a lot of other industries who actually don't need subsidising at all, but they use offshore accounts and Cayman Island investment companies to do their manoeuvre and their tax avoidance schemes. But nobody talks about them.
No.
Oh, because they're famous. Because they're famous, and we don't want to talk about people like that, do we? We don't want to talk about, and let's own up to people like Gary Barlow, for example, famously tax avoidance schemes, Katie Mueller, who actually got an award from an agency for being a tax advocate when she was actually using the same typical scheme. And, Daniel Craig, who was famously paid $80 million, and $40 million of that came from the British taxpayer for the Bond films. All these different things. Yet we're the ones vilified, and yet for no reason at all, just because we're an easy target.
Yeah, no, I would agree. So, well, let's talk about like the ethical dimensions of buy-to-let investment then. And I think the ethical considerations surrounding the buy-to-let market and the Fife buy-to-let market, they are quite complex and multifaceted. And I think on one hand, Fife buy-to-let landlords have filled a void in the Fife housing market and provided much needed shelter for many Fife tenants. And I think on the other hand, concerns then arise regarding exploitative practices by a handful of rogue landlords. I mean, it's a very minimal percentage of landlords that are actually rogue landlords are classed as that, and the potential
commodification. Yeah, it's the basic human need for shelter. Shelter, okay, let's cover that. In the very beginning, in 1999, I formed Fife Landlords Association with 20 other landlords. Now, I had realised at the time these rogue landlords existed. I experienced it firsthand, where one of them actually said something extremely derogatory about their tenant. And I thought, God, that's disgraceful. How could you do that? And I could understand the mindset he was in at the time. It was pretty difficult. There was no roadmap or blueprint to follow about what is best practice. There was no legislation in place to really cover anything. Everything was really geared against it. Yeah, there was no code of practice or anything like that. There was no professionalisation of it was still a cottage industry. in terms of just, one or two people. And you saw that in the statistics at the beginning. It was a third of the market it is now in terms of the number of houses in Fife. And it is over the country as well. So I then started with 20 other landlords, big landlords at the time, at the Fife Landlords Association, which went on to become the part of the National Landlords Association of Scotland. So what we got involved in was landlord accreditation, putting that all in place, letting agent accreditation. We also got involved in the formation of SAL, because SAL was another agency, the Scottish Association of Landlords, to professionalise the private landlords. And we also got involved in with Fife Council. I sat in the housing partnership for 10 years alongside John Mills, who is now head of housing. Previously to that, it was Derek Muir. It was various other people as well that stood in these positions. But I sat alongside them, and we formulated best practice for private landlords with Fife Council. We evolved to have Charter Mark. It was the first kind of accreditation for private landlords in the whole of Scotland, if not the whole of Britain. So Charter Mark landlord was a thing. We were one of the first landlords, if not the first landlord, to be Charter Marked as Parker Housing. We were also one of the first letting agents to be Charter Marked, and then subsequently it got rolled out to most of the Scottish local authorities after that, because they saw this was actually working very, very well, and actually elevating the private rented sector to a higher standard, voluntary, by the way, and therefore that's how landlord accreditation came about, and letting accreditation came about. So yes, you could say it was there was rogue landlords out there, and I can't dispel that myth at all. But there's certainly a lot less than there is today than there was then. And I know the economic think tanks, for example, the UK government housing body actually says it's about 20,000 landlords and 2 million, which represents 0.001% of the landlord population, in their opinion, are rogue landlords. 0.001%. That's actually less than 0.5%. That's less than 0.1%. That's about 1/100%. So according to the government, this is the government statistics, there's about 20,000 landlords in the whole of the UK which are problematic rogue landlords. This is like a sledgehammer to crack a nut, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah,
so
definitely.
The bottom line is, as the Fife population grows, there needs to be more properties being built for everyone to have a decent roof over their head. So that's probably the most important thing out here. The rogue landlords in Fife need to be put out of business. That's why we formulated the Landlord Association. That's why we work closely with the Fife Council as well. We don't want these people. They give us a bad name. It's exactly like double glazing salesmen. The majority of them are actually fantastic at what they do a great job, sell a great product, but you get the one-offs. The one-offs, and it's exactly like estate agents, isn't it? We have the typical example. You've got the estate agents that are completely unethical. We know them, and let's no name names though. They do exist. But it paints the whole industry in a bad light, and same with letting agents as well, doesn't it, Richard?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's the thing and then the media and things capitalise on that. If there's it's like the rogue landlord programs and things. So people think this is just a common thing that's everywhere.
Yeah.
And it is really it's a small percentage of what goes on.
It's great that we've got a more regulated rental market, which they've achieved over the last few years, with greater security for tenants, where they can rely on a decent home from a Fife landlord, providing high standards and for their safety and modernised home as well. I'm all for that, and I welcome working in joint partnership with the Scottish Government, which we did in the early 2000s. But today, that does not happen at all. There's a recent, and I posted on my own personal pages the other day, there was a recent housing blog that came out, an article from the Scottish Housing Department from Paul McLennan talking about partnership working, which actually mentioned nothing about partnership working in the private rented sector, and it talked about working with every other partner in the housing sector except the private rented sector, and all it talked about the private rented sector was about putting more legislation, and that was it really. Not about we want to work together with the private rented sector to get better legislation. No, we've just put in legislation without any consultation at all. Now, that's not duality. That's not That's not working in partnership, and that is not for a health. That then doesn't have a healthy private rented sector. That then causes fear, which actually encourages landlords then to exit the market, and everybody goes out there with their flags out going, hurrah! It's like, okay, but where are these people going to stay? Who's going to house them? Oh, they'll take back your private rented properties. No, they won't, because we're selling them to first-time buyers.
Yes.
And I will not sell. I will not sell a property. If I'm going to ever sell, I will never sell to a local authority. I will sell to a first-time buyer, and I have done that recently in the last couple of years. Sell to first-time buyers. It gives them the foot on the ladder. I'll sell at an attractive price to them as well to let them get a foot on the ladder. That's my most important thing. I will not sell into the private end, into the council housing list, because all the council are doing right now is they are buying properties from the private sector. In other words, they're buying and competing against first-time buyers to buy up stock are in the housing just now, causing further demand. Further demand only pushes prices up, and it actually takes them out the hand of first-time buyers. And yet it's the very same thing 3 or 4 years ago the council and the government was castigating private landlords for, was competing against first-time buyers. And yet they're now encouraging them in yesterday's article that are shared. They're now encouraging the local authorities to buy sector in order to do that. That's a crazy policy. Why are you not building them?
Yeah, no, you're totally right, and they're buying them back at quite a rate. And I think let's look at obviously addressing the crisis and moving forward as well. And to alleviate Fife's housing crisis, a multifaceted approach is necessary. And like you say, Jim, fairer regulation for Fife landlords to enhance tenant protections and things as well. And the incentivising property investment and development could contribute to more balance in the housing market. So I think that's really important on board, and exploring innovative models for, like, similar to what like European countries, we say this as well. Look at the continent and how the housing markets are there compared to our own. Everybody rents. People rent more prevalently, and that could provide insights into creating a system that maybe ensures decent and more affordable housing for everyone.
Yeah. Let's talk about this. Fife housing market has undergone substantial changes over the years, and the rise of the private rented sector and the proliferation of the buy-to-let investments and played a pivotal role. The generation of economic imbalance and ethical concerns associated with the Fife buy-to-let market have really sparked passionate debates about the responsibility of different generations and the moral implications of housing as an investment overall. You know, I do get it. As Fife continues to grapple with the housing challenges, collaborative efforts between policymakers and local government and central government developers and developers as well, and Fife landlords and tenants are all essential to creating that housing landscape that's fair and ethical and accessible to all. So my final question to you then, as a listener in here or watching this program or even reading an article, is only you can decide if buy-to-let is immoral. But let me ask this question first. If these Fife to buy-to-let landlords had not taken up the slack and provided the 14,613 extra homes in the last 40 years for people in the Fife council area, 14,613 extra homes, where would these Fife tenants be now? Where would they be living? That's an interesting comment, isn't it? Very fact is, because Fife buy-to-let landlords have taken up the slack and provided another 14,613 homes in the last 40 years. So where would these be tenants? Where would these tenants be living right now? Oh, they wouldn't be living in council houses. That's a fact, because they've no built them. So where would they live? They wouldn't be able to live. They need these houses. During the height of the council house building in the 1950s, the UK local authorities were building on average around 147,000 council houses a year. In the last decade, UK local authorities have only averaged building around, drum roll, 1,400 council homes a year each.
That's crazy.
Honestly.
I mean, I don't even mean to laugh.
In 40 years.
That's astounding. That's astounding, the difference.
Here's another statistic for you. It would cost Fife Council around £2 billion to build all these 14,613 properties of buy-to-let homes today that local landlords have funded themselves. Now, that figure actually assumes that they're building on their own land to do it.
Yeah.
So it's even more money that has been invested if that's the case. It would cost Fife Council $2 billion. They've not got that money. And yet, Fife landlords have bailed Fife Council out of their obligation for 14,600 homes by investing over £2 billion in the private rented sector, in the rental housing sector. Let's call it the rental housing sector for tenants. It really need properties for let. And it's because they can't buy, not through any circumstances, the fact that a landlord has bought that property, is they can't buy because they don't have a job, they possibly don't have the credit rating to get a lending from a bank, and that's not anything to do with us as landlords or investors. We can't influence that at all. That is a government policy decision. So where do you think then the blame should lie for this? That building sum would take up 100% of the local authorities' budgets for the next 2 to 3 years. That's not their housing budget, that's their whole budget.
Yeah.
Yep. Fife Council have a budget of £975 million. And that means they'd have to put that budget for the next 2 to 3 years completely. Therefore, you'd have no bins, you'd have no education, you'd have no police, you'd have no services, you'd have nothing. You'd have nobody working in council. Nobody would be paid at all. So think about it, how much that would take of even their housing budget. They've been there for the next 20 to 30 years of the housing budget in its complete entirety, just to actually replace that $2 billion that private landlords have actually funded into the private rented sector, into the housing sector for Fife.
I think, well, for me, and I think for everybody listening, that then really makes you think and conjures up questions. Like, I mean, you really need to question, is buy-to-let practice immoral, or in fact, is it necessary?
Exactly. Is buy-to-let practice immoral, or is it in fact absolutely necessary?
That's what you need to be asking.
What other things do we need to think about then, Richard?
I think you should think as well, we've just already voiced that, should landlords really be restricted to one rental property each? Is that something?
That's absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
Right, let me look at this, and let's break this down. If every landlord was restricted to one each. By the way, we'll be exactly where we are right now. Because 99% of landlords, or 94% of landlords, only have one property anyway in Scotland. 5% have 2 properties. So that's 99% of landlords have 2 or less properties in Scotland. So if anybody's shouting out there, oh, landlords should only be restricted to having one property, okay, we're exactly where we are right now. So what we're saying is we're wanting to focus on the 1% that have more than 3 properties or more, which is a complete minority in the landlord population, as I've just explained there. So the 1%, focusing on them only having one property, wouldn't make a dent in anything. It wouldn't change anything at all. The majority of private rented sector properties are in the hands of landlords with one property only anyway. So when shelters shout out and go this soundbite about, and crisis shout out and the government shouts out, landlords should only have one property. Exactly, that's what they've got now. So that's nothing new. And why are they doing that, Richard? For votes.
Yeah.
Because the electorate does not realise that only 90%, 94% of people in Scotland only have one property anyway as a landlord. 5% have 2. That's crazy. So that doesn't float with me at all, that question about, should as recently voiced, landlords be restricted to one rental property each. They are already by choice. And you're not going to encourage any more landlords to come in and to take one property, or they would be in this market already. Wouldn't they?
Yeah, I know.
So what's the next question?
I think really,
it conjures up for you.
Well, I think for what we've covered today, I think people really need to, listeners who are watching, and we really need to think about what would the housing landscape really be like without rented accommodation, because it would be very different than what it is just now.
If you never had any rented accommodation, you'd have no mobility of labour. You'd have people would have to buy a house, because I'm talking about rented accommodation right across the board, not just private. If you did any rent accommodation, people would have to buy a house, they would have to spend all that money to enter the market, they'd have to on a mortgage and arrangement fees and solicitors fees, they'd have to then sell a house if they want to move. And some people actually move in their early days. First-time buyers move in a short period of time. They usually move within the first 1 to 5 years. They will never be able to recoup these entry and exit costs like you would in private rented. Private rented is I pay my deposit, I pay my first month's rent, and the rent is the maximum I'll ever pay for the property.
Yeah.
Home ownership, a mortgage, is the minimum you'll ever pay for that property, because you'll have to pay for all the repairs and improvements as you go and everything that happens in between. So see how that's a huge difference. So that's how the housing market would be without rented accommodation. It is a necessity to accommodate the mobility of labour and the people that do not want to rent, and people that can't afford to buy. It's their choice maybe. They maybe actually just want to spend all their money. They don't want to save their money for a deposit. They'd rather just rent. They don't want to tie all their money up in a house and capital as well. They just choose not to do that, because when they get to their twilight years, all your money's stuck in your property. You can't get it out. So some people just want to live for the day and actually just rent as a result of that and have that choice. That shouldn't be taken away from them.
No. Yeah, a lot of people choose to rent nowadays, and it's like you say, the option for them is so easy because the entrance costs and things as well. I think as well that of the 21,663 Fife households that are in the private rented sector at the moment, I mean, how many of them have little or no option other than to rent? So where would they be if there was no private rented sector?
That's hit the nail on the head. That really puts it into some clarity in the fact that where will over 21,000 people be without the private rented sector at this point in time? You know, they would be. That's exactly the word that you should use, Richard. Completely displaced, nowhere else to go. They'll be living in temporary accommodation because council won't be able to house them in proper accommodation because they've not built them. There's been no policy in place for the last 40 years to replace the existing council housing stock, which was actually sold off as a result. So you can't put the blame back on the 1980s when that was done, because that was done for a reason at that time, for the investment to come into the private ownership market for housing. There was in that time, the ownership was seen as, if you took ownership of it, you'd be more responsible for it, therefore you'd know more after it, therefore you'd be better standing person in the community. That's how that was looked at. And I think personally, overall, that rhetoric worked to a degree, but the failure to replace with existing social housing was the nail in the coffin for the private, for the rental sector overall, because of the huge decline in that. But you can't keep going back blaming the 1980s government for that. You have to take some responsibility at the government today and the successive governments that have been in between as a result. And that's been a combination of Conservative, Labour, Liberal, SNP, the Greens even today. You know, that's a success for all these governments. And I'll come back to saying, when we're finishing off here, what's happening to the 110,000 houses that's supposed to be getting built, Paul McLennan?
I know.
Oh, you've now actually admitted that you can't build them because you've not got the resources to do it. If you had put this in the hands of the private sector to build these houses for social rent, I think it would get done quite easily. Again, I come back to saying, I think this is academics running the country. We are right now. This is people just, and when I talk about academics, I talk about people just come out of university, they've got no commercial acumen, they've never run a business in their life, they don't know what running a business is like, they don't know what it is, you know, boots on the ground, actually front face, the coal face everything, and I will use a coal face mentality here because, you know, we're in a minor community, and that's what it was like for these people. They were at the coal face all the time, they understood what happened, and the people in the background were making decisions which were actually possibly not the right decisions at the time. And this is so similar today in the housing market, in the private rented sector, and the whole rented sector overall. And the fact that the people making decisions right now don't understand what it's really like at the coalface, and they're listening to people, academics as well, coming up with statistics from places that aren't even a proper sample of the population. For example, let's take city lets. Let's call city lets out on this. City lets have a minority of lets in cities, because they're called city lets. They don't get, we know it's city lets. So, and most letting agents aren't on city lets. But it's mostly agents that are in cities that are on city lets. Therefore, the government goes to city lets and goes, oh, you're putting out these publications about saying that rents at these historical highs, and they're so high and they're over £1,000 and that. And that's like, and we think that's ridiculous, and people can't afford that in villages. And it's like, well, people don't pay that in villages, you idiots. because city lets don't have that information, because they don't list people like us on it. My average rent is under £500.
Yeah.
My average rent is under £500, and it's been under £500 for the last 30 years. It's never gone up. It's gone from 424 on average over the last 30 years to 487. If I took inflation into account, it should be 623.
Yeah.
So I've actually helped out all the tenants that I've housed by taking a 23% hit against inflation and reduction. So I've actually lost out as a result of it. Now, I've not technically lost out, because I've got a decent return on investment. I'm okay with that. I'm satisfied with that. And some of that investment and these savings have actually been passed on to my tenants, which is what most landlords do in the private rented sector. We've done it with Rent Locally. We took some of the Edinburgh lets there and actually did the same calculations. We took it with Sam Dyer Property Investments. We took some of his from the West Coast and also Fife as well. And we took his ones, and it showed exactly the same pattern of behaviour. We are not our rents are never keeping up with inflation. We are actually giving tenants an inflation reduced, busting decrease in their rents.
Yeah.
So I tell you, where does it sit? Is buy-to-let really moral, or is it an immoral investment? In personal, I've chosen to invest, and I'll talk about this as well just before we finish off, just to make it clear here where I stand. I never bought a pension. I never invested in a pension. My pension was property. So I invested all my money. I never got the tax advantage, by the way, that you do get put into a pension. I don't get 20% back on my money when I invest in buy-to-let. So therefore, I'm taking a hit on that straight away. I'm not getting that huge update. I should argue that people that put money into pension shouldn't get that deduction, because that's not fair, because my pension is for the future. So if I'm putting in for the future and buy-to-let and property, then I should be getting that tax back as well on my investments. But did I moan about it? No. No landlord moans about that at all. So I've chosen to invest in it, put a roof over people's heads. Some of the most vulnerable people in Fife, I put a roof over their head, and I've taken huge risks with them. Some of it's actually worked okay, and the tenancies have gone really well. Quite a few of them, it's actually gone disastrously wrong, destroyed the properties. They've not paid their rents, even though it's paid by the welfare system. They've just not paid it. They've spent it on themselves. I've taken the hits over the years for that, as many private landlords have done as well. One recently we've got, Richard, we've taken a hit for 22,000 in terms of the refurb for the property, because the tenants destroyed it. Tenants destroyed it, 22,000 in hit. Plus I took a hit, when you think about the rent as well, for about 15,000, because the COVID legislation kept them in place. How many people would do that with their pension? None.
How many would be able to do that?
Yes, exactly. Because they've only got one property, they'll be wiped out completely. That would be the end of them. So my point is, I've put a roof over everybody's head, and I've kind of been a social capitalist. Let's be honest, that's how I look at it. And I've chosen to invest, I've chosen to take the risk, it's been my choice. But let's look at the government, the Scottish government, who have pensions. So every MSP has a pension. Now, what you don't know about every MSP is they get a huge lucrative pension paid on their behalf by the taxpayer. Now that pension invests 10% of it now, because I've brought this up, it's now been restricted. 10% of that money actually gets invested. This is the money in pensions. Now this applies to overall, right through everybody's pensions, because if you look at your pensions and where they're getting invested, you'll now see that they'll more than likely get invested in places like Diageo, which is alcoholic drinks. They'll get invested in Betfair, which is online betting, and Ladbrokes, online betting again. They'll get invested in Glencore, which is actually exploration, which is actually bad for the planet. That's mining.
The vape
You'll get
companies as well.
invested. You're getting invested in vape companies. Yeah, they're getting invested in vape companies right now. One of the biggest in the world, which is ET or something like that, ETX. And then they're also getting invested in other areas. For example, pharmaceuticals like AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, Beecham, all these different companies. Now, I would then argue then, if I'm being unethical, putting a roof over someone's head, then if the Scottish Government and the MSPs are getting their money invested in these companies, which take advantage of people, because remember, people have alcohol addictions, which is Diageo. People have betting addictions, which is Ladbrokes and Betfair and all the different other companies. People also have illnesses, so pharmaceuticals. So we're taking advantage of people on illnesses by making profit out of their illness through a pharmaceutical. And then also through mining, it's like we're taking advantage of people, you know, we're destroying the planet, but we're making a profit for our pensions out of mining. So then you've got to then ask yourself the question, is it not the case that investing in a pension is unethical as well then?
Well, I could definitely argue that point.
But that's the Scottish Government, that's the MSPs. So even the Green, even Patrick Harvey, even his wee sidekick, Ross Greer, and even the other one, which is Lorna, they all have government pensions which invest in these industries. And these are the same people castigating private landlords right now, saying that private landlords are unethical because they're investing in housing, which is shelter. So then what are you doing then if you're taking advantage of people that are ill, people that have got gambling addictions, people that have got smoking addictions, people that have got drinking alcoholic addictions? What are you then doing, Patrick Harvey, Lorna Slater and Ross Greer, as well as every other MSP and every other MP in the country? I rest my case, Your Honour. I rest my case, Your Honour. Buy-to-let is extremely ethical if it's done the right way.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing. As long as it's done the right way and done correctly and done for the right reason, and that's to provide shelter and house people. And like you say, Jim, what you've provided for a lot of vulnerable people over the years.
I would challenge Patrick Harvey, and everybody can tag him in on this if you want. You're more than likely happy to tag him in on it. I would challenge Patrick Harvey to come and spend a week with me and my tenants. And exactly see how they live and how we look after them. Then you'll see a different side completely. But Patrick Harvey doesn't want to learn that. Patrick Harvey, Paul McLennan doesn't want to learn that either. Now, I'll tell you a wee secret. Now, I'm not going to tell you who said this to me or who's actually said this, but from other parties, a few MPs, MSPs have actually said to me, look, we actually believe wholeheartedly in the private rented sector. We think it is an essential thing to our modern day world, to our housing strategy. However, Jim, and this is what's said next, is we can't go out and say this publicly because that aligns us directly with the Tories, because they have said that. And therefore, we don't want to be aligned with the Tories. Therefore, that's why we don't support you publicly.
That's crazy. And that's where it gets political.
I rest my case, Your Honour. So I'm not going to name names, but it's all, this is all truthful stuff. So then if the public don't understand that about private landlords, and it's because we're in such a minority. There's only 250,000 of us in Scotland. There's 6 million people. 250,000 of us is a drop in the ocean. It's nothing. And that's why nobody cares. That's why nobody's bothered. Everybody wants, people will kick us out there, and they get to kick us. But the people that support us, they don't really want to support us because it's nothing to do with them. They just want to go in and enjoy their life. I don't blame them for that at all. So we've got an uphill battle to win the hearts and minds of the people.
That's where it's important, Jim, where if you are a landlord and things and you do want to have a voice and stand up for what's right, you need to be part of a body in which
you need to be part of the Scottish Association of Landlords. Scottish Association of Landlords. Even though you've only got one property and you say it's not your fight, guess what? It is your fight, because it's going to affect you at some point in time, because the legislation is going to be changed next year, because the COVID legislation they've got running now cannot be run again. It can only be done in 2 or 3 times, and then you have to do something after that or drop it completely. So as when it comes next March, they're going to have to do something legislatively to put in place, because they can't run with the same legislation again, or they're going to have to just stop it and just go back to normal. But this is like King Canute, if anybody knows the story. You know, sitting in his seat at the sea and trying to say, commanding the sea to hold back the tide. And it's like, you've got no chance. The housing sector is going to move on regardless, because there's so many different dynamics in it. Even the private rented sector, even the home buyer sector, it's all going to change. You're not going to be able to control any of that at all. And this is where they don't understand the implications of what's going to happen for their actions.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And I think there's so much. We've covered so much today, and I think what's important to remember is a lot of this is fact, and these stats and things are factual. I know we've interjected some of our views and things, but it'd be interesting to hear what other people think as well. Obviously, I mean, feel free to join in or contact us about what we've discussed today, because there is a lot of controversial topics there. But the question is buy-to-let really unethical? And well, you can make your own mind up, but I think we've kind of laid that out quite well today. So you, Jim?
Yeah, it's up to you to wrap it up. That's me. Good. I'm not going to say anymore. I've gone forever.
I know you would. I know. But no, thanks for all your insights, Jim. It's really interesting, and those facts and statistics today really prove a profound point for myself, and I'm sure everybody that's listening. So we'll leave it there today, and thanks for everybody that's been watching. If you do want to ask anything further, you could jump in the comments. We'll pick them up, or you could message us direct, or come to myself direct as well and ask anything buy-to-let related. And until next time, Jim, we'll leave you in the sun.
Yep.
Yep. And we'll catch everybody next time.
Thanks, guys. Bye.